everybody to a special event tonight, sponsored by your Grinnell League of Women Voters and featuring Grinnell's own Janet Carl in the program Hard Won, The Long Road to Women's Suffrage in the United States. Janet Carl is a member of the Grinnell League of Women Voters. She is a former state representative representing Grinnell and surrounding areas, and a member of the statewide committee that planned the events in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Janet is willing to take questions following the program, so sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Sarah. And greetings, everyone. 10 days ago, Kamala Harris walked on stage in a white pantsuit. In doing so, she acknowledged the suffrage movement and the right to vote that had evaded American women for so many years after the founding of our country. Here she was, the first female vice president, the first African and Asian American vice president. Such a sweet victory after the disappointment of 2016. And yet it simply underscored how difficult the route has been for women in politics. It took 100 years following the passage of the 19th Amendment to elect a woman to the second highest office in the land. And before that, arguably, at least 100 years to even get the vote. My goal tonight is to give you the basic chronology leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, and to show, as my title suggests, that this right to vote was indeed hard won. I have a couple of sources that I have drawn from almost entirely. One is The Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. It's even though you know the outcome, it's one of those things that is a gripping story. And the second is Strong-Minded Women by Louise Noun, which focuses on the women's suffrage movement in Iowa. And at this point also, I'd like to thank Carolyn Jacobson for helping produce a slideshow that will allow you to see pictures of important people and not just me, which will be good. So when did the suffrage movement begin? Well, many sources say it started in 1848 with the convention at Seneca Falls, New York. Others say it really began with the American Revolution, the creation of a democracy, which required the participation of all citizens to succeed. We remember Abigail Adams' advice to her husband, John, as he went off to the Continental Congress: remember the ladies. But of course, in terms of the Constitution, they didn't remember the ladies. The Constitution left the question of suffrage to the states, except when superseded by federal law. As Elaine Weiss says, we the people really meant we the wealthy white men. Abolitionists and suffragists sprang from the same roots. Most suffragists began as abolitionists. For example, Lucretia Mott, Susan Anthony, Lucy Stone, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton all began as members of and organizers for the American Anti-Slavery Association. In 1840, there was a world conference on anti-slavery. It was held in Britain, which had already abolished slavery. So the conference was really focused mostly on eliminating slavery in other parts of the world, primarily the United States, which at that time enslaved 2.5 million people. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her new husband, Henry, attended this conference. Henry was a delegate. The American delegation to the conference had 50 people, among them 7 women. And Lucretia Mott led the woman with these women delegates. However, the organizers of the convention refused to seat them, arguing that women should not be speaking in public, which was not an uncommon belief about women's roles at the time. Well, Mott and another female delegate insisted that the question be put to the vote of the entire convention of 350 people. They argued the question all day and eventually refused to seat the women. Well, it was at this convention that Mott and Stanton became acquainted, and both were enraged by the sexism they encountered. And they determined to call a meeting of like-minded women once they were back in the United States. But this wasn't going to happen for another 8 years. So it was then in 1848 that Mott, Stanton, and 3 other women put an ad in the local paper calling for a women's rights convention, quote, to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. Stanton composed a Declaration of Women's Rights that followed the form of the Declaration of Independence. In it, she listed a number of grievances and inequities related to divorce, property, child custody, higher education, and admission into fields such as medicine and law. 300 people attended the conference. I think that's a pretty remarkable number. And Stanton's declaration was passed unanimously as a statement of beliefs and principles. However, the next day, when each item was debated, sort of like planks in a platform, Stanton's proposal that women should have the right to vote was regarded as too controversial and would take the public's mind off other rights that were more immediately important to women's well-being. Frederick Douglass stood and spoke in favor of the vote for women. He said that men would never willingly give women the right to vote. Women would have to fight for it. The resolution did pass, but by a slim majority of those present. Douglass remained a firm supporter of suffrage for all women for the next 50 years. The passage of the pro-suffrage resolution was received with horror. Headlines included "The Reign of Petticoats" and "The Insurrection of Women." Many signatories to Stanton's declaration withdrew their support. However, all this didn't seem to discourage Stanton. She said, "When men and women think about a new question, the first step in progress is taken." Another one of the mothers of the early movement was Lucy Stone. She was a 1947 graduate of Oberlin College, the first college to accept women as students. And she began shortly after her graduation as a speaker and organizer for the Anti-Slavery Society. She was said to have a voice like a silver bell. And because of her oratorical skills, she was considered the voice of the early suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony was tall, prim, and a teetotaler, a teacher and abolition organizer. She first met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, although history books often claim that she was one of the organizers of the first Women's Rights Convention. Thus began a partnership of 50 years. She was known as the workhorse of the movement. In contrast, Stanton was married, plump, jovial, and the mother of several children. She was a writer and said, "I forged the thunderbolts, and she, Susan Anthony, launched them." Another important early leader and one of Iowa's claims to fame is Amelia Bloomer. She and her husband moved to Council Bluffs in 1855 from the East Coast. She had attended the Seneca Falls Convention, but did not sign the Declaration of Sentiments. She launched a newspaper called The Lily to promote the temperance movement, but Stanton began to write for the paper, and it soon included many articles about suffrage. Bloomer is probably best remembered as the originator of bloomers. But in fact, the Turkish dress, as it was called, had been around since the 1820s and consisted, as you can see, of flowing pants gathered in at the ankle with a short dress worn over the top, loosely sashed at the waist. Bloomer argued that women's fashions in the 1850s were unhealthy, that whalebone corsets literally deformed internal organs, and petticoats were heavy and prevented any active movement. Bloomers gained popularity for a period of time. Stanton wore them and cut her hair short. Bloomer also, of course, wore them. Newspapers in Dubuque and Burlington both mentioned that Iowa women had taken up the new fashion. Then the fad died. Stanton decided that bloomers were getting more attention than the more serious issue of women's suffrage. It's also important to note that Amelia Bloomer was, according to Louise Noun's research, the only woman in Iowa to espouse women's rights during the period before the Civil War. And in terms of impact, look at what you're wearing tonight. I'll bet there's not a whalebone corset or petticoat to be found on any of you. Well, as wars often do, the Civil War suspended the suffrage movement. After the war began, abolitionists were concerned that Lincoln was not sufficiently committed to their cause and that the Emancipation Proclamation did not go far enough. In 1863, Anthony and Stanton formed the Women's National Loyal League and recruited 2,000 women to take petitions for emancipation door to door. They gathered over 400,000 signatures, which they sent to Congress. The petitions helped Lincoln convince Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. At the end of the war, the suffragists thought that universal suffrage was just around the corner, that the abolitionist and suffrage causes were inseparable, both being based on the idea of equality and justice for all. The post-war amendments were a series of steps that ensured the end of slavery, the 13th, the equal protection of the law to all persons born or naturalized in the US, the 14th, and the right of Black male citizens to vote, the 15th. And with the passage of these amendments, the abolitionists, of course, were ecstatic. However, the suffragists were not so happy that the right to vote was not extended to people who were already citizens, namely white women. In fact, Stanton, Anthony, and Stone decided not to throw their support to the 15th Amendment, and this was the beginning of the end of the coalition with the abolitionists. Anthony said, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." Both Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, leaders of the abolitionists, argued that the nation couldn't take two huge changes at once. It was, they argued, the Negro's hour. The women's hour would have to wait. As I said before, elections and voting rights were a matter for states to decide, and some states did allow some women to vote on some things. In 1848, Iowa allowed women to vote, but only for city and county bond issues. I'm not sure of the rationale there. But here's an interesting bit of Iowa history. In 1865, Senator James Crookham of Oskaloosa introduced a bill to enfranchise white women age 21, soldiers age 21, Negroes age 21 who served in the Army. This is his language, of course, not mine. And male Negroes who had $250 in property, their taxes paid up, good moral character, and literate. Now, this was not an ideal bill. It was certainly not universal suffrage. And of course, Black women were not even mentioned, but it was a start in Iowa. The bill died in committee, but we know that Crookham is still a familiar name in Oskaloosa. Iowa suffrage groups petitioned the legislature for a suffrage amendment throughout the 1870s. In 1898, a state constitutional amendment was defeated in the legislature. But as Western states started to enter the Union, they entered with women's suffrage already in place in state law. So for instance, Wyoming in 1869, Colorado in 1893, and Idaho in 1896, all these states entered with allowing women to vote. So there were some divisions in the ranks of the leadership of the suffrage movement. In 1872, Susan Anthony and African-American activist Sojourner Truth and 150 other women across the country went to the polls to register and vote. Anthony was arrested and in court was not allowed to testify on her own behalf. Suffragist Virginia Minor's husband filed a case on her behalf, maintaining that Missouri's election laws were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court heard the case and ruled against the claim, saying that American women, and here they're really talking about white women, were a special class of citizen. These two failures led Stanton and Anthony to create the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, whose goal was to pass an amendment to the US Constitution that added the word sex to the list of reasons why the right to vote could not be abridged. This organization eventually attracted 2 million women and men, and its symbol was the yellow rose. Lucy Stone and her husband instead formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, whose goal was to work for suffrage state by state. The two organizations finally merged in 1890 with Stanton as president. And at that point, Anthony and Stanton had drafted amendment language. They just needed to find someone in Congress who would be willing to introduce it. And they did find California Senator Aaron Sargent in 1878. That amendment language sat in Congress for the next 40 years, although it was introduced in every succeeding session of Congress. So to take us up to 1900, we summarize in this way. Women had been talking about their lack of rights, specifically with regard to marriage and property, since at least the 1820s. Women worked hard for the abolition of slavery and the enfranchisement of former slaves. They organized and created a list of specific grievances, with suffrage turning out to be the most controversial. So where by the late 18th century had they gotten? Not very far. But by 1900, there was a new day and some new leaders. The most famous Iowan to be involved in the fight for women's suffrage, and by the way, that's the phrase that they used, was woman suffrage rather than women's suffrage, was Carrie Lane Chapman Catt. She was born in Wisconsin in 1859, but at a young age moved with her family to the area around Charles City. There's a famous story told about her becoming a feminist at age 13. It was election day, and her father and the farmhands got dressed and got ready to go off to vote. And Carrie noticed that her mother was not going, and her father told her that voting was men's work. And I guess a light bulb went on for her at that moment, and she decided to devote her life to changing that situation. She was a wonderfully well-educated and intelligent person, graduated in 3 years from what is now Iowa State University as valedictorian of her class, and then later on became an organizer for 15 Iowa counties. And she spoke at the 1889 Iowa Women's Suffrage Association meeting in Oskaloosa, and was described as scholarly, witty, and convincing. In 1890, she married George Catt, her first husband having died some years earlier. He was a civil engineer in New York City, where she met and became a protege of Susan Anthony. George said he would earn the living for the two of them and she would do the organizing. She became president of NASA in 1900. At this point, Catt was willing to agree that in Southern states, NASA chapters could pursue state amendments that extended the franchise only to white women. Later, she changed her mind about this idea, and the Southern women formed their own Southern Women's Suffrage Conference. Alice Paul was another new leader of the cause. She had fought for voting rights with the Pankhursts in England, and she was much more given to marches, protests, jailings. She was described as militant, fanatic, and zealous. A PhD with a Quaker background, Alice founded the much more assertive Women's Party, which split with NASA in 1913 because she rejected the state-by-state approach that NASA was taking after finding that there was no hope for a federal amendment. Another important player came on the scene, the national scene in 1912, and that was Woodrow Wilson, who was elected president in that year. He mostly tried to avoid the suffrage question by saying that it was a matter for states to settle. On Wilson's inauguration day, 5,000 suffragists marched down Pennsylvania Avenue under the leadership of Alice Paul. Marchers were grabbed off floats, thrown to the ground, their clothes ripped off. Police did not intervene. Federal troops were called in to restore order. And then another war intervened into the movement. And when the US entered the First World War, Carrie Catt, although she was a pacifist and a member of the Peace Party, agreed to support Wilson in his decision to go to war in order to show women's good citizenship and patriotism. She pledged the loyalty of the 2 million members of NASA. Alice Paul and her Women's Party refused to support the war. They picketed the White House and argued the hypocrisy of sending sons to war to support democracy in Europe, while at home, their own mothers couldn't vote. After the war in 1918, Catt went to Wilson, expecting his support for women's suffrage in return for all that women had done during the war. Wilson did finally appeal to Congress to pass it. The House did, but the Senate didn't. Well, this led to another national protest in Washington by the Women's Party on February 10th, 1919, in which protesters burned Wilson in effigy. 36 women went to prison. The Senate voted down the proposed amendment again. Catt opposed these protests, believing they were not the way to win the vote. Her mantra was, optimism plus a plan will yield results. Catt had again become president of NASA. In 1919, groups of Black women all over the country had formed their own suffrage clubs, and they sought admission to NASA. Catt asked them to withdraw their request until after the amendment had passed. The 19th Amendment, as proposed, would give all women the right to vote, which would place Black women on the same level, politically at least, as white women. This was a deal breaker for Southern strategists and their allies. Alice Paul was equally unwilling to embrace the cause for Black women. And author Elaine Weiss says, when forced to choose between truly equal rights and women's rights, between insisting on justice for all or accepting injustice to protect their own cause, the suffragists almost invariably took the easier, less noble path. It was, as we look back on it, a shameful part of suffragist history. Finally, in the spring of 1919, the amendment passed both houses of Congress and went to the states. And I will just remind you of what this very simple amendment says in part. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Then the battle for ratification started. 36 of the 48 states had to ratify. Wisconsin was the first in May 1919. Iowa was the 10th, only a month later. By August, another 7 states had voted to ratify. Now the suffragists were in the fight of their lives. If only 13 states voted against ratification, the cause would be lost. And of course, the least enthusiastic states were in the South, where anti-suffrage sentiment was strong. Finally, it all hung on the vote during a special session in Tennessee. The anti-suffragists were pouring free whiskey for the state representatives and senators on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville. Carrie Chapman Catt marshaled her forces from her suite in the same hotel. Weiss says that most of the legislators who visited with her about the upcoming vote were drunk. I'm going to quote now some comments from 2 Tennessee senators. These comments were made on the floor of this very contentious debate during the special session. So Senator Herschel Candler said to his colleagues, "You are being dictated to by an old woman named Catt, who is nothing more than an anarchist. After this amendment has passed, you will find that Congress has compelled we people of the South to give to the Negro men and women their full rights at the ballot box. Then you will find many of your counties sending up Negro representatives to this House." Senator Andrew Todd responded, "That is the most unfortunate speech that has ever been made upon the floor of the Senate. These slurs do not meet the approval of the good women of Tennessee." And then, trying to inject some humor, he added, "Talk about petticoat government. If there is a man in this house or in the gallery who has not been under petticoat government since the day he was born, I want him to stand up. I am ready to go into petticoat government." Well, the suffragists loved it. And in a way, petticoat government did rule the day. The deciding vote in favor of ratification was cast by a young man, Harry Byrne, a legislator only 24 years old. He had promised his votes to both sides, and he wore a red rose in his lapel that day, the symbol of the antis. But he had received a letter from his mother, 7 pages of family news, complaints about the weather, and her advice and hope that he would vote for ratification, which he did. Thank you, everyone. Happy 100th birthday to the League of Women Voters, and may we continue to make voting easy and safe for everyone. Thank you.